Picture this. It's New Year's Eve at Mar-a-Lago, right as we're heading into 2026. You've got guests dripping in mink and sable gathered around the pool, a massive house band blasting in the background. Up on stage, a speed painter is whipping up a portrait of Jesus Christ in literally 10 minutes flat, and it gets auctioned off by the president right then and there for a jaw-dropping $2.75 million. Crazy, right? But here's the thing. This whole bizarre, glittering spectacle of extreme wealth was basically a smokescreen. What almost nobody in that room actually knew was that a massive, highly classified military op to seize Venezuela's dictator, Nicolas Maduro, was already in motion. We're talking days, maybe just hours away from launching. It's a wild, jarring contrast, and honestly, it is the absolute perfect way to set the stage for the deeply reported, speculative future history we're going to unpack today.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into regime change, analyzing the Imperial Presidency. We're going to objectively map out a very specific blueprint of a hypothetical second Trump term, based on the extensively reported vision of journalists Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan. Now, right off the bat, you should know this isn't just some random flight of fancy. The baseline for this whole 2025 and 2026 scenario is built on a massive foundation of real-world reporting. The authors actually conducted over 1,000 interviews across 3 years. They sat down with campaign officials, White House staff, lawmakers. They even had a direct sit-down with Donald Trump himself in this projected timeline of March 2026. So as we go through this explainer, keep in mind that the highly specific scenarios we're looking at are synthesized projections directly rooted in those extensive conversations with his inner circle.
Okay, so there's actually a fascinating irony to how this whole timeline kicks off. Think about it. If Trump had somehow eked out a win in 2020, his second term could have been a total mess. He'd have been hobbled by the ongoing COVID pandemic, dragged down by massive global inflation, and stuck with that incredibly messy withdrawal from Afghanistan. His approval ratings might have absolutely tanked. But by losing in 2020 and, crucially, refusing to accept that loss, the authors argue he forged this unshakable, deeply consolidated loyalty with his base. Building up that stolen election myth and surviving intense political peril basically allowed him to purge any skeptics. In a totally twisted way, losing in 2020 might have actually paved the way for a much, much more powerful comeback. Which brings us to a really big number, 34. 34 felony convictions. Normally, a single charge like that would permanently bury any politician. It's game over. But this blueprint highlights a truly preternatural capacity for survival and branding. Instead of becoming a career-ending vulnerability, those 34 convictions were aggressively repackaged into a massive witch hunt narrative. By pointing to these cases, they spun a story of a grand conspiracy. And the wild part, it didn't alienate supporters at all. It actually tightened their bond. It literally transformed what should have been serious legal jeopardy into a highly potent political asset. So to really grasp this unconstrained vision for 2025, we have to flash back to the evolution of his first term. Back in 2017, Trump entered the White House as a political novice, right? And he was constantly getting stymied by well-credentialed generals and government lawyers who kept pushing back on his impulses. By 2019, all that frustration boiled over into just deep, deep anger during his first impeachment. Then, moving into 2020, he resolved to completely purge what he viewed as the deep state. That exact trajectory, that specific frustration, created the blueprint for Trump 2.0, a second term staffed entirely by total loyalists who will just execute orders without second-guessing a thing. The authors actually pinpoint a highly specific turning point for this huge shift. Picture November 2019, in the small dining room right next to the Oval Office. The president is sitting there watching televised impeachment hearings, and he's seeing officials from his very own government, people like George Kent and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, testifying against him. He is just boiling with rage, asking his aides, who the fuck are these people? Fast forward to when he was finally acquitted. While his staff is popping champagne and celebrating, he reportedly just sat there scowling, declaring that it never should have fucking happened. That right there was the exact moment the desire to clear out perceived traitors hardened into an absolute unbending purpose. Well, how exactly do you execute a purge like that? The answer lies in something called Schedule F. Now, I know it sounds like a wonky, boring, bureaucratic term, but the authors claim it is the absolutely crucial, razor-sharp tool needed to achieve this unchecked executive power. Championed by his budget director, Russell Vought, Schedule F is a proposed mechanism to reclassify potentially tens of thousands of traditionally apolitical civil servants. And once they're reclassified, they can be easily fired and replaced with ideological loyalists. It's basically the mechanical foundation for completely reshaping the entire federal government to the president's will. As this hypothetical administration takes shape, you start to see two very different approaches to wielding power emerge. On one hand, you've got figures like Stephen Miller. He's acting as the architect of rapid, quiet executive action, just forcing through emergency declarations at stunning speed and kind of ignoring the fallout. But then, on the other hand, you've got Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, who earned the nickname Ice Barbie in this text, treating governing primarily as a stage spectacle. We're talking dancing at Mar-a-Lago for the cameras and performing strength for an audience of one. It really highlights the dual engines running this administration. You have ruthless, quiet policy shifts happening right alongside highly visible, performative loyalty.
To actually pull off this dual-engine approach, the text outlines some massive structural advantages projected for 2025 that simply did not exist during the first term. First up, broad immunity from prosecution granted by the Supreme Court, which essentially removes the threat of legal constraint. Second, you have a highly compliant Congress, where the leaders are effectively acting like presidential staffers, totally eliminating traditional checks and balances. And finally, there's this massive cultural shift. They describe a literal safe space for donors and officials called the executive branch, which is a pricey, members-only club part owned by the president's family. It represents the total merging of presidential power with family financial ventures, like the crypto industry.
Now let's talk about the global shakeup envisioned here, because the speed and scale are just staggering. The whole post-World War II architecture is systematically dismantled. Funding to the United Nations slashed in favor of a new board of peace that's stacked with sympathetic autocrats. NATO gets completely hollowed out, not just by questioning treaties, but by actively treating partner nations as adversaries that need to be coerced. The World Trade Organization is completely bypassed to make way for punitive one-on-one bilateral deals. And perhaps most dramatically, the authors project the U.S. joining an all-out, highly volatile war alongside Israel against Iran early in the term. It's a world where American reliability vanishes, and everyone else is forced to rapidly rearm and fend for themselves. To explain this super aggressive foreign policy, the text introduces a concept championed by the administration's admirers. They call it the Monroe Doctrine. It's pitched as this contemporary spin on the Monroe Doctrine, basically asserting absolute U.S. dominance. But the authors warn us that trying to find some deep intellectual, ideological underpinning for all this is a total trap. It's a fool's errand. These massive geopolitical shifts aren't about grand strategy. They're driven far more by a visceral, feral instinct for power, a highly intuitive read on people's vulnerabilities, and a tendency to just give in to shockingly impulsive behavior in the moment. And that philosophy of power translates pretty brutally back on the domestic front. The text describes the president standing on the White House lawn in June 2025, reportedly declaring, "I was the hunted and now I'm the hunter." That single mentality predicts a thoroughly weaponized Justice Department. It paints a picture of an administration that absolutely does not think twice about ordering up federal investigations into perceived political enemies, kicking off a widespread, unprecedented campaign of retribution aimed at basically anyone who had previously stood in their way. But this pressure doesn't just stop at political rivals, it bleeds heavily into civil society and the private sector. The administration is shown to be completely comfortable using extraordinary powers basically on a whim to dictate the internal policies of private companies. To give you a vivid example from the text, in the summer of 2025, the usually self-effacing CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, allegedly feels it's necessary to present the president with a literal 24-karat gold tribute in full view of the media. It's a crazy anecdote, but it perfectly illustrates the sheer capitulation and extraordinary pressure placed on corporate America to visibly align with and literally pay tribute to the executive branch. Navigating shifting power dynamics like this requires incredibly unpredictable and flexible tactics. I mean, we all remember the chaotic aftermath of the 2020 election, right? The refusal to concede, completely breaking the tradition of meeting with the incoming president. Well, contrast that with the projected 2024 transition. The authors describe this surprising scene just 8 days after a rancorous campaign. A highly solicitous, super deferential 2-hour fireside chat with incumbent Joe Biden. The president-elect actually lavishes praise on Biden's handling of Ukraine and the economy, and casually asks about the personalities of foreign leaders like Putin and Xi. It just demonstrates an ability to completely flip behavior on a dime to suit the immediate power dynamic of whatever room he's in. So looking at this extensively reported blueprint, we're really left with one absolutely crucial question. Does this speculative regime change outlined by Haberman and Swan represent a unique, temporary anomaly tied to just one specific figure?
Or does this systematic dismantling of institutions, the weaponization of justice, and this sheer concentration of unchecked power represent a permanent, completely irreversible shift in the very nature of the American presidency? It is a profound, incredibly provocative thought about just how fragile our political norms and institutions truly are when they're tested by a feral instinct for power. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.